So now we're at a point where the original exit plan, the path we were going to go through, is had collapsed at some point, and our original entrance point had also collapsed. So we were literally trapped inside the wreck.
Off Gassing, a scuba podcast with host Nick Hogel. Just before Christmas of last year, I had a chance to sit down and speak with Brett Eldridge, a technical wreck diver based in Southern California. After years of enjoying recreational diving, Brett found his way into the technical world and eventually found his love for deep wrecks. I spoke with Brett about his journey as a diver, his blog, Wrecked in My rEvo, photogrammetry, rebreathers, and the dive that led him to write the article, Close Call, on the IJN Sata. A must-read for anyone who is thinking about or currently participating in technical wreck diving. Please enjoy. Brett, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well. We're close to Christmas Eve.
Yes. Happy holidays. How are the holidays for you? Is it a blessing or a curse?
It's a curse. I'm not a big holiday person. I keep threatening. I don't know if threatening is the right word, but I keep telling my wife and my family one of these years I'm going to go to Truck Lagoon right around December 15th and stay there through like January 5th and just do nothing but dive wrecks and celebrate Christmas and New Year's there. But I don't want to be a bah humbug.
And you're based in San Diego.
Actually, it depends how well you know California. I'm in between Los Angeles and San Diego. I'm based in an area that's basically Laguna Beach. Well, most people know Laguna if they know California. So I'm like an hour and 20 minutes north of San Diego and like, depending upon traffic, an hour to an hour and a half south of LA.
Okay. Yeah, no, actually, I used to live in Southern California for, almost over 10 years ago. Yeah, over 10 years ago now. But I was based out of the Big Bear Lake area.
Yeah, it's beautiful up there. No diving. Well, no wreck diving for sure.
No.
But yeah, I lived in the Bay Area. I was in high tech for 25 years in cybersecurity, and then got out of there about 6 years ago and moved back to Southern California.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, actually, I still have a lot of family members in the Bay Area. I'm a Santa Clara County born baby. Usually make it up there every few years just to visit the aunts and uncles. But it's wow, I think it's been like 4 or 5 years since I've been back there. But I do miss California.
Yeah, I lived in, my wife and I lived in Los Gatos, like downtown Los Gatos, in like an old
Oh,
Victorian
okay.
house for a long time, and I loved it there.
Oh,
But I'm happy to be living closer to the ocean now.
yeah. So that will, lead into my first question is tell me about how and why you got into scuba diving. Tell me about that first breath, that first experience. What led into you wanting to gain that first certification?
I first got certified, I think, in the late 80s. I was in college, and a friend of mine and I decided to just try scuba diving. So one summer when I was working in Santa Barbara, I got certified. I think my first dive was, one of the certification dives was like visibility of 5 feet in the Pacific Ocean here. And I don't know why I continued, but I did. For a long time, just given my work responsibilities of building and starting companies in Silicon Valley, my idea of diving or my version of diving would be to, go on vacation with my wife to Hawaii, get a couple recreational dives in here and there, but nothing really serious. It's interesting. I used to get like scuba diving magazines or one of those magazines. And in one of the issues, I saw an article about a place in Andros Island in the Bahamas. And they had this dive called, I think it was Over the Wall. Basically, you go to the edge of the wall. There's some really neat geography there or geology. And you go down the cliff and there's this kind of like bench almost at like 185 feet deep. And I thought, man, it'd be so cool to go see that. So, like I said, I mean, for a long time, I just did recreational dives, and then I went there. I finally, had enough of work and decided to do some more diving, and I went there, and I after a while, and they got to know me. I did that dive, and then I started getting more and more into technical diving because I really enjoyed it. I probably did recreational diving for 20 years at least before I got into more technical diving.
Okay, okay. So the dive that you did to 185 feet, was that hopefully not just like a single tank or back mount, but was it just kind of, because I know how places can be sometimes like, yeah, we could take you down there, or did you build up a skill set to get down there when you finally reached it?
Well, if you want the truth is I did it on a single back-mounted aluminum 80. We had staged some tanks, and we had extra tanks with us, but it was basically like a touch and go type dive. Not that I recommend people do that type of dive on air, and this was probably a good 10 to 12 years ago before I really knew about Trimix and all the other stuff. So, yeah, I did do it on a single aluminum 80. I will note that there are people that have been much, much, much deeper in that same area than me on air. Not that I recommend it. But yeah, the thing is, that's kind of when I started to really understand what it took to do technical diving. So yeah, I did do some, not crazy, but some things that you probably shouldn't do there, like most technical divers have. And then I started to realize, like, hey, look, if I'm really going to do this, I'm going to do it right. I need to get training on how to do more technical dives. So that's when I kind of started down the path of mixed gas, decompression diving, all that stuff.
When you started going down that path, how did you seek out instructors? Like, did you do most of that training in California?
It's a really good question. One piece of advice I would give people that are going down this path of technical dive training is seek out really good instructors, either through people or reputation or whatever it is. When I first started doing it, I did open circuit. So I think that nowadays they call it ANDP or advanced nitrox decompression procedures, which is basically twin set with, I think, one deco gas enriched nitrox, which was 50%. So I did that in Mexico. I didn't do it here in California. It was down in the caves, not in the cave section, but down in Mexico in that area. And then I did a bunch of dives. And then, if you want to go deeper, you really need to get trimix. So I got open circuit trimix trained. I did that in Florida, which is kind of where I started to get my passion for Rex, because a lot of the dives off Pompano and Fort Lauderdale are Rec dives. So I did full open circuit trimix, hypoxic. Kind of when I was doing that, and when I was doing dives after that, I realized that it just really wasn't efficient to do dives at that depth on open circuit. It's not that you can't do it. I mean, I like diving open circuit because I'll call it simple. But I did start to realize that there are massive benefits. There's costs, but there's massive benefits to doing closed circuit, which is kind of why I started down that path as well.
How did you, when you first started to approach the technical side of it, the open circuit training, how did you find that? Like, was it really challenging for you coming from a recreational background, or was it something that you just kind of eased into, or I should say went into with ease? Because I know that's a different boat for everybody.
It is different for everybody. I mean, I would consider myself, when I went into the ANDP course, I would consider myself a very good diver, open circuit single tank diver. My sac rate was really low. My trim was good. My buoyancy was excellent. But it's really tricky. I mean, I had a very, very hard instructor. He was good, but he was very hard. And, doing drills and doubles and using multiple gases and doing all of it at the same time really takes a lot of practice. And I honestly thought I was going to fail that course. I got better as we went along. And I remember he said to me when we were sitting on the side of a dive site, he said, "Do you think I should pass you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, why?" And I said, "Because I learn well and I'm willing to adapt and grow." And he did pass me. And I spent a bunch of time after that just doing, I'll call it simple, relatively small decompression obligation dives just to learn a twin set, learn multiple gases, learn how to carry tanks, learn how to hand off tanks. So I spent a bunch of time doing that before I progressed onto trimix. But yeah, it was definitely challenging for sure for me.
Okay, okay. And then when you were spending time practicing doing all these types of dives, generally, I feel like when you kind of get into this sort of diving, there's a big emphasis on team. Did you have people that you were working with, teammates, or a buddy that was going down this path with you, or was it kind of just reaching out and seeking the I don't want to call them insta buddies, but just trying to find that compatible teammate?
I actually didn't. And the reason for that, like I said, is at this time, I was still working, and my work schedule was just, crazy. I mean, I was literally working in a startup that grew from 150 people to 5,000 people in 6.5 years. And so I didn't have, I'll call it the freedom or time to be able to work around other people's schedules. So what I would do is I would book a trip to a location where I knew they had technical diving, and I would basically book a session with a dive guide to go do technical dives. So it is a bit different. I mean, it wasn't like I had a constant buddy or buddies or group that I did all this with. I would just, whenever I had a chance, I would travel around and do it on my own. And I wouldn't dive solo back then, but I didn't have like a group of people I did it with. It's a bit different, I think, than most people. Not different, good or bad, just different.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that, everybody's path is their own because I kind of am almost in the same boat in the sense that, I'm trying to progress into that technical world, but where I live, I'm constantly traveling, so I don't have that specific dive buddy. So it's kind of like, okay, let me go somewhere where I know that there's technical diving. I know that they'll be able to facilitate, but then it's always kind of nerve wracking because I remember my first dive because I just completed the ANDP course earlier this year, and man, the time flies. But so I just completed the course earlier this year, and I remember after the course going on that kind of first dive, like, okay, I got the skill set, I earned the pass, let me go on this first dive. And then it just kind of got like, hey, here's somebody that you could go with. And there is kind of a little bit of a nerve-wracking situation going into that because we're going into a lot more serious territory. It's not just like the recreational side of it. And then just kind of building, I guess, that trust over the course of a couple of dives. It was absolutely amazing, and I really, really had a good time. But yeah, I always just kind of wonder how people navigate it because I know certain people in the areas that they're in, they're able to come up with that group, build that team mentality, and have that working with them as they progress through the sport. So I guess my next question is, as you started moving, you knew you wanted to do deeper dives, longer dives, make things more efficient. Talk to me about the rebreather path.
When I first started diving rebreathers, it was probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. A lot of it was for efficiency. At that time, helium wasn't as bad as it is now. I mean, helium nowadays is pretty expensive. But, if you're going to do a dive to, let's say, we'll talk meters here, the 60, 70 meters, you're going to burn through a twin set of 1845 or 2135. And in most places of the world, that will cost a few $100s at least. And then you're going to use deco gas, right? You're going to use 50 and probably 100% or 80 or something in that area. So you're going to burn through a ton of gas, even if you have a good sac rate. So as I started doing more of these open circuit deep dives, it just like people were telling me like, hey, look, you can keep doing it. And that's the way people have done it for years. But if you're really going to do this and you're going to do a lot of it and you're going to do it all over the world, then it makes a lot more sense to do it on a rebreather. And so I started going down that path of learning a rebreather. And, I did the typical rebreather path. I took a course. I dive a rEvo. It's a good rebreather. There's a ton of good rebreathers. I'm not a religious rebreather nut. I think they're all pretty good. They all do basic two functions. They supply oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. They all do it in slightly different ways, but they all provide those two functions. I did my first course, and then I probably did, I don't know, 150 dives on my rebreather. And then I went and did what they call Mod 2, at least the training path I went down. which is kind of a 60-meter cert. And then I did a couple hundred more dives, and then I got a cave cert and a rec cert on my rebreather. And then I did mod 3, which is 100 meters. And that whole progression took probably, with COVID, it slowed things down a bit, but it probably took 5 years or so. Nowadays, I would say that probably 90% of my dives are on a rebreather. I still do some open circuit, but it's mainly rebreather diving. And I love diving a rebreather personally. It gives me a lot of freedom and flexibility. And the costs, especially for overseas diving, the costs are immensely more efficient than diving open circuit for those deeper dives.
Currently, right now, I'm kind of going down that rebreather path. I feel like, once you take the advanced nitrox decompression procedure, or once you start taking courses like that, where you're moving into that territory, the rebreather conversations start happening. And, especially this day and age, it is tough because of the price of helium. So it's the rebreather kind of starts sounding appealing, but then there's a lot of issues to weigh, obviously, like, okay, like how much am I going to be doing this? Is it worth, the cost benefits? So I actually was looking into a rEvo, and I just have some questions around that. Like, so was that the unit that you decided to take your courses with, and then you just said, oh, okay, I'm used to this unit, I might as well keep moving forward, get this unit? Or were there certain things that appealed to you about it? And then a follow-up question would be, because a big thing for me is travel, and I've been kind of on the fence, and a rEvo seems like it's kind of on the fence, but it seems to be pretty good for travel. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, a lot of people get, I'll call it religious about rebreathers, and I'm really not. I've cross-trained on a couple different ones. I've dove a KISS, I've dove some other stuff, and they're all good, at least from major manufacturers, The reason I like the rEvo was really two reasons. One, it's a very, I'll call it flexible rebreather. I can repair most things on it. I can't repair or replace the counter lungs, but I've had mine for 6 or 7 years and haven't had to do that. The number of connections you make is pretty small, and there's 2 breathing loop connections and then the cover. So that's kind of nice. But portability was definitely a factor for me, for sure. I travel all over the world. I mean, I've had my rEvo to Bikini Atoll. I've had it to Truck Lagoon. I've had it to Malta. I've had it to Croatia. I've had it to Palau. I've had it to Fiji. I mean, you name a pretty remote place, and I've had my rEvo there. And it travels pretty well. It's not the lightest unit out there, but for a rebreather that's, I'll call it back-mounted, self-contained, it's pretty good. I've abused it quite a bit, and it hasn't failed me. So I think all rebreathers have pluses and minuses, but I started on a rEvo. It was recommended to me. I looked at a bunch of different ones, and it was recommended, and I started on it. Like I said, I've cross-trained on a couple different ones, but I've just stuck with the rEvo. It's not necessarily a money thing. It's just like I'm familiar with it, and I've done so many dives on it that I know how it works. I know its pros. I know its cons, and I'm just comfortable with it. So I stick with it. I have friends that I dive with very often on a number of different rebreathers, and they, some people who have rEvo divers, and they've gone on to dive other units, and now they dive those other ones. So I think it's really about weighing what you as a diver are looking for in a rebreather, to be honest.
Okay, yeah, and it's, I'll be honest, it's kind of a tough thing, because as I start researching, I mean, I guess it's a lot like other pieces of equipment in the scuba industry, because on one side you'll have the fanatics on why this is the best piece of equipment in the world, and on the other side, this is the worst equipment. Why would you ever even consider looking at it? And as somebody new, it's like, okay, how do I navigate this?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the biggest things that I've been looking at, is like, okay, well, what do I need? Let me start with that foundation. What are things? And that's a huge thing for me, is the travel aspect of it, and which kind of cuts a lot of units out. Like, I've heard amazing things about the JJ. I mean, like most people on the planet will say, or rebreather divers on the planet will say, that thing is the 4x4 of rebreathers, rock solid, put that thing through the dirt. Yeah. But for me, I'm like, there's just no way I could do it. And so that's why it's kind of, hard to navigate. And then especially as I meet more rebreather divers, more people in this side of diving, it's like, they start getting further and further apart as, like, oh yeah, don't ever look at that unit. So it gets
Yeah,
quite a bit tough. So I love to hear people's opinions on things.
yeah. Like I said, I'm not. I'm really not religious about any one rebreather or another. They all have strengths and weaknesses. I mean, the Revo, you can't dewater it. If it floods, you're kind of screwed and you're bailing out. I've knock on wood, I've never had mine flood. So, every rebreather does have pros and cons. And, one of the things you can do if you're looking at rebreathers is, I don't know about your neck of the woods, but here you can go, try dive a bunch of different units. You can book time with an instructor and say, like, look, I just want to go try it for a dive. And they'll, explain it to you. They'll explain the pros and cons. If they're good, they'll explain the pros and cons of a specific model, and they'll help you set it up, and then they'll take you for a dive on it. It's just a shallow 10 or 15-foot dive or whatever, but you can get an idea of what it feels like, what it breathes like. They all are a little bit different. But, I think the one piece of advice I would give is if somebody tells you they have the perfect rebreather and it's the one for everybody, then I don't know that I would believe them. If they say, like, hey, here's a rebreather, manufacturer X, Y, or Z, and here are the good things and bad things, and here's a different one, here are the good things and bad things, then I would probably listen to that type of person. But there's, nowadays
Yeah.
with modern rebreathers, there's a lot of really good units out there, to be completely honest. And like I said, I have friends I dive on with that have JJs. They do amazing dives on them. Friends with the Dive Right Choptima, friends with Kiss, friends with, I mean, like, you name a rebreather, and I've probably been diving with somebody who dives that unit. And they all dive them for their own reasons, and that's totally fine. Like, I'm not religious about one rebreather or another. My Revo works, and it's been working for a long time, so I keep using it.
That actually kind of reminds me. So the instructor that I've been working with, I've actually had a try dive on a Revo and a couple other units. And as I was talking to him about rebreathers, kind of telling him the same thing, or I think he might have even told me about this, but he's said the same thing. He's like, there is no perfect rebreather out there. And his quote is, if you can show me a perfect rebreather, we can walk right over there and I'll show you Moses in the burning bush right now. He's like, I'll go show you if you can show me
Yeah,
a perfect rebreather, because there is no perfect rebreather.
there,
So
there
it
isn't.
is about, weighing those pros and cons. Well, and then I guess I wanted to obviously go into, so you said that as you started going to Florida, that was what kind of ignited your passion for wreck diving. Can you talk a little bit about that? Was it just seeing the first wreck and wanting to go inside, or was it just kind of the mysterious historical aspect about it? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's progressed a little bit. I mean, I like wrecks because they are a little bit mysterious sometimes. I do like wreck penetration, but I am a history buff as well, or history nut, I guess. And nowadays on my wreck diving, I do a lot of research before I go to a location, and I research the wrecks there. I research why they're there, how they got there, how they sank. So for me, it's kind of a combination of, it's a little bit archaeology, it's a little bit history, it's a little bit mystery. We've been finding new wrecks here in Southern California over the past 3 or 4 years, which is fun as well, and doing identification. I found it as my passion. Like, I just really liked it. But yeah, I think I got my start on wrecks. In fact, I know I did. I mean, I had, I dove the Kitty Wake and Grand Cayman and other stuff. But once I started diving in Florida for some of my training, there's just so many wrecks there. Some of them natural, some of them sank on purpose. But I just found them fun. Like, it's a specific thing that you go dive. And I like, it's almost like a mission approach. And I like missions. So for me, wreck diving is the perfect type of diving.
Okay. So when you started going down that path, so earlier this year, I was able to actually take I did an advanced rec course. So kind of, I'm kind of prepping, gearing myself going into the overhead environment. So did an advanced rec course. I don't know. Have you been to the Subic Bay area of the Philippines?
No, I've been to like Puerto Galera and I've been to Malapascua, but I've never been to Civic Bay and Coron. I mean, I know about them; they're on my list, but I haven't been there. So I know there's a ton of World War II wrecks there.
Yeah. And so I ended up doing a advanced rec course, which, kind of build line laying skills, just kind of getting somewhat comfortable going into those overhead environments. And as soon as I went in, that kind of first penetration, I could definitely see the appeal. I felt like there's a very heightened sense of awareness as soon as you kind of get into these spaces. And so that's why I'm just kind of curious. Can you talk a little bit about that first course or that first time you started going into the rec? Was it just a light bulb moment for you? Or was it just kind of a progressive thing that, oh, this was kind of cool. Let me see a little bit how much further I could go, which obviously would be the correct way to do it, but just kind of curious to see how it went for you on that note. Your training side starting to get you into the recs.
Yeah, I think, the first time I remember going inside a rack, I don't know if this was the first time, but the first one I remember was the Spiegel Grove in Florida. And it was a single AL80 dive. We didn't do massive penetration. We went down, corridors where you could always get out and see light. But I went with a dive guide. I had booked him because I wanted to see the wreck. And we did some cool, I'll call it penetration, although, like I said, you could always see light. And I thought it was just fun. It's like looking in doorways and checking stuff out. And I really enjoyed the experience. And then I started doing more and more of it. And like I said, I did my kind of open circuit trimix training in Florida, and then my initial, at least Mod 1 rEvo training in Florida. You either do caves or you do recs in Florida for the most part when you're doing deeper stuff. And I liked recs, so I kept doing more and more of it. So it was definitely a progression. And, I took an advanced rec course as well on my rebreather and did a ton of penetration and line laying and, other skills like that. So it was definitely a progression over like a 5 or 6 year period, but it did start in Florida. And like I said, I think my first, I'll call it quasi penetration dive was on the Spiegel Grove.
What do you mean by quasi penetration dive?
Different people define penetration in different ways. On those dives on the Spiegel Grove, I had a single, aluminum 80, or as you guys would call it, an 11-liter tank. And, you shouldn't be doing stuff where you can't see daylight with that type of gear. So we would go down corridors and we would go through bridges and we would go through areas, which some people would call penetration, but you could always see light. Like there was no period of time on those dives where I couldn't get out in a matter of seconds, as opposed to like, what I would consider a more, I don't know if real is the right word, but a penetration where there's no daylight and where, you can't just immediately get to the surface, either because of decompression obligation or there's a hard barrier. And like when I first did the dives on the Spiegel Grove, they were all no deco dives. So it's a little bit different when you start combining deco and overhead, no immediate access to the surface dives.
One of the highlight of the core, or the one of the things that I remember the most when I took the advanced rec, there's a couple famous recs there, but a very popular one is called the New York, and I think it's a old battle cruiser from the 1800s. I'd have to research my knowledge again or research it a little bit more. But there's a couple points where we're going in and literally you could not turn around if you wanted to. It's just kind of like essentially like a single track. And I just remember like the when I speak about that heightened sense of awareness, I'm like, man, this is it. I'm here. And you have to just go a little bit further and then there's enough room for you to turn around and come back out. But just that sense of like, I'm here right now. There's no quick exit. There's some thinking that needs to be done. There's some time that needs to be put in. And granted, it wasn't a very long amount of time, but just kind of those factors kind of hitting you because you hear about it, when you're going through training or you're reading or things like that. But when you're actually there in the moment, it's really it's kind of hard to explain. I mean, I'm sure you know all too well, but that was one of the highlights of the trip for me because I'm like, man, this is it. This is like in my face reality right now that, because there's the thought of decompression, like, okay, I'm in the water, I can see the surface. Someone put it to me as you might be 20 feet away, but you're 30 minutes away. It's not just like, oh, I can just pop over there real quick. And when you're actually there and there's a hard barrier in front of your face, it's a very like awakening moment, I should say. um, so yeah, no, it's exciting.
Yeah, I mean, it's, anytime you have either a soft barrier, a decompression obligation, or a hard barrier, cave or wreck or whatever it is, the risks go up. And that's when you need to start, planning for contingencies, extra gas, doubles, rebreather, bailout, whatever it is, whatever type of diving you're doing, you definitely need to start thinking about, like, if there's a hard barrier to the surface, you definitely need to think through and plan and do contingency planning for sure. At least you should.
So I'd like to talk about Wrecked in my Revo, that the a blog that you have. And so have you always had a passion for writing and getting information out there? How did that all kind of come about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I've always been a reasonably good writer. I haven't, I exercise it at work and in other areas, but I never really wrote a blog. And then when COVID hit, I really did kind of three things in kind of progression. But I realized, first of all, that when COVID hit in whatever it was, at least in the US, I think it was like March of 2020, that my overseas travel was probably done for a little while. And it was right around that time when I started doing some local diving here in California. I used to always travel for dives for the most part. So I started doing local diving. And because I had, I'll call it, time on my hands, I started writing about the dives that I did. And I never really set out to make it like a big thing. I just figured, like, okay, well, I'm learning new stuff. I'll write about what I learned. So I started Recting My Revo and I started writing about it. And then the other two things that happened is that I got linked up with a bunch of local divers here in Southern California. Again, specifically wreck divers, because I like wreck diving. So I started going out and doing wreck dives and met a few people. And I ended up connecting with a guy named Tyler Stalter, who has done a ton of wreck diving here in Southern California. And he and I share a passion for finding new wrecks. So, we both have our, I'll call it, roles in that and in our own skill sets. And he's really good at identifying potential new wrecks, and I'm good at writing and photography. So we started combining our skills, and I'm decent at writing. So I started updating Wrecked in My Revo with new wrecks that we found. And then a couple of years, I started getting into what's called photogrammetry, which is kind of the art and science of turning a bunch of two-dimensional photographs into a three-dimensional model. So I started, posting those to the website. But it's just been a kind of a progression. There was no end goal in mind other than, like, hey, I'm doing some really interesting stuff that I think other people would like reading about. So I just started writing. I don't do it for a living. I don't do it to make money. There's no subscription price. It's just kind of like my passion. And I write about the dives I do and the trips I take. And I put out pretty detailed trip reports for the locations I go to, and, photographs and photogrammetry models of wrecks and things like that. So it's more, for me, it's more like just my passion of combining history, writing, photography, photogrammetry, and putting it all out there.
So when I was reading through, it was saying you're still somewhat new to photogrammetry. Did I say that correctly? Photogrammetry, yeah. And
Yeah.
how is that process? Like, I'm sure that must, like, is that something like, having a technology background, was that just kind of easy for you to get into something like, oh, this looks like a lot of fun? I mean, I know it's becoming quite, I don't think popular is the right word, but it seems like a lot more people are doing it these days, which is absolutely amazing, because then we get these actual visual pictures of these areas. So you just want to talk a little bit about that?
During COVID again, I was like, every year or so, I'd say, like, okay, what's the new skill I'm going to learn? Like, I got to do something. So So one year I'm like, okay, like I had seen some photogrammetry models. I don't know if they were Becky's or one of the guys in the UK, but I'd seen some photogrammetry, and I thought, man, that looks really cool. I'm going to learn how to do that. So I just started researching it on my own. And, I first started by building photogrammetry of something on land, and then started building photogrammetry of stuff in the water, and got better and better and better at it. And, nowadays, this isn't a bragging thing, but there's not many people that are doing really deep rec photogrammetry today, especially not on what I would call an artistic level. I mean, last year, actually, for the first time ever, this past year, 2023, I won the Underwater Photographer of the Year for a rec. It was a photogrammetry model, and that's the first time it's ever happened. It's always been a photograph that's won that contest for wrecks. For anything, actually, it's always been a photograph. And I did it of a wreck here that we found and identified. It's an airplane called a Bearcat. And I think, part of the reason it won the contest is because it's not what I would call like a normal photogrammetry model. It's not just natural light, kind of blues and greens. I lit the whole thing, took 800 photographs or whatever it was, and it's very, I'll call it picturesque. And it's very, like, I'll call it artistic, even though I'm an engineer. So, for me, photogrammetry was just a new skill set. And since I've started doing it, I have realized that there's a lot of different uses for it in wreck diving. We've used it to help correctly identify a misidentified wreck. We've used it to track changes over time in other wrecks. We've used it to identify wrecks, like the Bearcat. We measured wingspan and length and looked at the ratio and compared it to the actual Bearcat to verify. So there's a lot of different things you can use it for. And I really enjoy doing it. It combines, at least the dives I do, deep water diving with photographs, with computers, with history. And as you said, like when you look online and you see some of these 3D models, it's almost like you're there. Every time I build one, I actually send it to my mom. She's turning 80 in February. And she looks at them online and is just like amazed. So I think it's something that even if you're not a diver, you can go look at these models and appreciate in a different way, because you can maneuver it, you can twist it around, you can zoom in, you can really get a feel for what the wreck is like, unlike just a static photograph. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's just a lot more, I'll call it realistic.
So just because I'm curious a little bit about it, when you're prepping to take a photogrammetry picture or three-dimensional picture, are you just going around taking as many photos as you can, kind of all point, up, all around, up top of it, and then you come back and then just load it into a program? Is that kind of how it works?
The rule of thumb is there should be 75% overlap in the photos. Each photo should have a 75% overlap, and that's so that the software can pick out identical points between the photos to build the model. And that's one of the tricky things, especially when you start doing things like gun barrels or things with like sharp, pointy edges, is getting around those things and getting enough photographs that the software can actually use to align one photograph to another and understand where they all are. It gets really tricky. But yeah, like a typical airplane, like a single or maybe two-person airplane, World War II era, is probably going to be, for me, 800 pictures or so. Again, there's kind of an inherent trade-off between how much detail do you want and how much time do you want to spend and how many photos do you want to take. I mean, you could, theoretically, you could take 10 photos of that same airplane if you have great visibility and build a photogrammetry model. But you're not going to get the color and the level of detail that I'm trying to get in my models. I mean, on the Bearcat, you can actually zoom into the cockpit and you can see there's a scallop up on the dashboard of the cockpit. There's the stick still in there. There's part of the oxygen mask assembly, and that's just in the cockpit. So there's an immense amount of details that I try to build into the model. I'm not saying that's the right way to do it or the wrong way, but the more details you want, the more photos you have to take and the closer you have to get to the thing you're photographing, which necessarily means more photos. But yeah, essentially you go all around it in 3 dimensions, up, down, kind of X and Y axis, and take enough photos so that they can relate to each other. And then you put it into software and build it. I think on my website, in the Rect and the Revo, or Rect and my Revo website, there's a presentation or a couple different presentations I've given that I've posted there on just kind of like the basics of how to do photogrammetry.
What, just curious, what do you shoot on?
I have 2 different cameras I use depending upon the dive and the mission. And one is smaller. It's a Sony A6400 in an Nauticam housing. Nowadays, I use Keldon lights. I use video lights when I'm doing photogrammetry. I have retro strobes for stills, but so it's either a Sony A6400 and I also have a Sony A7R4. The A7R4 is an amazing camera, but it's a lot bigger. And so if I know what I'm going to go do and I know what's there, I'll take the bigger camera. If I'm going on kind of an exploratory dive and we're trying to find something new and I don't know what I'm going to run into and I need something that's smaller and easier to move around underwater, I'll take the 6400. But they're both great cameras. I mean, photogrammetry is kind of interesting because you take so many photos and you put it into software. So like things like backscatter and high ISO and other parameters that you would never want, and I'll call it a regular still photograph, aren't as impactful when you start building photogrammetry. So that's both good and bad. But yeah, I shoot both the 6400 and A7R4.
Oh, okay, cool. I have a A7 IV, and I just do land photography, just strictly hobby. But I really, really do like that camera. I had a A7R2 and then upgraded to the A7 IV. And yeah, no, I think Sony makes an absolutely wonderful product. But I have yet to bring it underwater. I'm still kind of on the fence just because it's to kind of add that whole different aspect of to my underwater experience is quite a bit. I mean, I just the housing, and then just terrified of like the flood stories or whatnot.
Yeah.
So I was like, man, I'll take the A7R2 underwater, because if that floods, I won't be as heartbroken. But it's such an older model that a lot of companies don't make the housing anymore. So most of the housings I would have to buy would be secondhand, which then you're down the path of the other problem is like, what if something happens with the housing? Then how are you going to find parts? And I know there's probably a network out there to where I could bring the A7R2 underwater, but then like I said, it's just like, do I really want to add this? Because it is a whole different just ballpark you're going into when you start bringing the camera underwater. And I just don't know if I think it would be a lot of fun, but I don't know if I'm quite there yet.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is, you really need to be comfortable diving at whatever types of diving you're doing before you take a camera, for sure. We recently went and dove the Britannic, which is a pretty deep wreck, and you have a rebreather, 3 or 4 bailout tanks, a scooter, and a full frame camera. I mean, it's definitely a lot, and if you don't have the muscle memory for all the other parts of diving that you're doing, then I don't recommend bringing a camera. You really need to be comfortable in the water, comfortable in the types of diving you're doing before you even think about it. And then on cameras, obviously start simple before you start working your way up to full frame cameras with flashes and photogrammetry and all the other stuff. It's years of progression to get to that.
Yeah, no, and that's why I'm just like, let's hold off on that until maybe a little bit later. But I did want to ask about a specific article that you had in your in Rect in my rEvo. I would assume that the article gained quite a bit of attention. I know when I first read it, I definitely at certain points I was kind of having chills go through my spine, because that's a very life experiencing moment, and I don't know how to quite put it, but at the and I apologize if I say this wrong, but the close call on the IJN
Sata, yeah, it's the IJN is Imperial Japanese Navy. We did that dive in August of 2022. And basically, as you saw on the blog, I laid it out pretty much minute for minute. But for the people who haven't seen it or read it or know about it, what happened was 4 of us went inside the wreck. We went with a guy who's a local diver who knew the wreck. The Sata is not dove very often, to be honest. I mean, very, very rarely is it dove. But the guy that we went with had done it a bunch of times. And there was a one-way route. So basically, you enter the wreck at one point and you exit at a different point. And the Sata is an oil tanker. The sister ship to the Sata is called the rEvo, which is a very popular dive and plow, by the way. It's a beautiful wreck. But the thing with the Sata is it's upside down, and which means it's basically crushed and it's a mess. So 4 of us went inside, and we were going to do this one-way route where, like I said, you go into one part of the wreck and you come out a different part. In the middle, there's this area they call the bottle room, which is an area where there was a bunch of like sake bottles or something. So we go in, and this isn't right, but we didn't lay a line. And all 4 of us are very experienced rebreather wreck divers. And, in hindsight, that was a mistake, obviously, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So anyway, so we go inside, and, normally on a wreck, like, like, okay, I'm on the 3rd deck and I'm going south, which means I'm going towards the stern, and then I'm going to go down a level. And so even if there's a silt out, you can kind of find your way back. because you can, at least for me, I form a mental map in my head where I'm at and what's going on. Inside the Sata, it was like a complete maze, and there was no straight corridors. There was no straight up or down. There was no. It was just jumbled metal everywhere. So we get about this is about 30 minutes into the dive, but about 10 minutes into the penetration, and because it was kind of slow going because of the tight restrictions, and like I said, there was four of us. So the guy who's leading it comes back to us, and you're on a rebreather, so you can kind of talk. And he says to the three of us, the exit path is blocked. We need to go back. And at that point, we didn't panic. The four of us just kind of like said, okay, like, let's just figure out what we're going to do. So at that point, we tied in a line. There's an old saying, if you're lost, don't get loster. So we tied in a line, and all four of us started going back towards our original entrance. And like I said, all four of us were on rebreathers. We checked like, how much scrubber time do you have? How much oxygen do you have? We all had plenty of time. And that's, I wouldn't do these types of dives on open circuit personally, but with a rebreather, there are risks and costs associated with it. But the one benefit you get is time in cases like this. So we went back to the entrance, or to find the entrance, and we couldn't find it. So we went back to the point where we tied in the line, and the four of us basically came up with a game plan. And the game plan was the guy who was a local who knew this wreck and knew the sister wreck, the Eero, would go back and try to find a different way to go out towards the original direction we were going, or the original entrance. And so he disappeared and came back, and disappeared and came back. And this went on for a while. And, he was on the line. He took the line with him the whole time. And the three of us were basically just sitting inside this wreck at it, like, I don't know, 110 feet deep, 30-ish, 35 meters, something like that. We were in the wreck for quite a while. And this guy came back at one point, and he said, well, I basically, he had a slate, and he wrote, like, good news, bad news. I found the original entrance, but as I was laying line to get out, it collapsed. So now we're at a point where the original exit plan, the path we were going to go through, had collapsed at some point, and our original entrance point had also collapsed. So we were literally trapped inside the wreck. And we had told people that our runtime would be 2 hours, so we knew they would be looking for us. And they did. They came looking for us, and we were banging tanks inside the wreck to let them know we were alive in the general area we were in. So to make a long story short, after kind of like 3.5 hours of the dive time, there was another guy. His name is Antti, who's a rock star diver, has done multiple rescue operations and stuff. He actually had gone inside the wreck and found our line that we had laid, and found us, and we all got out. So basically, 4 divers were trapped inside this upside down oil tanker from World War II that had collapsed. And we ended up getting out with our lives. So we ended up doing about 2 hours of decompression. So the dive was, called 5.5 hours. So after this happened, we were all, I don't know if it was shock. We did a lot of things right. We didn't panic. We didn't freak out. We stayed together. We put in a line when we knew we had to find the original entrance. We had told people our run time. But when we finished that dive, we got back on the boat. And the first thing I did after I took a shower is I started writing notes. And I wrote kind of 4 pages of notes in my notebook. And I gave it to the 3 guys with me inside the wreck to read through it and make corrections. And then I also gave it to the people on the surface who were doing surface support to give their input. When I got back, I wrote a blog post. That is what we published. We decided as a team to wait until we were ready to talk about it before we published anything. So I waited a little over a year. Like I said, it was August 2022. And we decided to basically, hopefully for the benefit of the wreck diving community, basically publish and talk about what happened and the lessons we learned. So we gave a presentation at DEMA in November of this year. And the day after we gave the presentation, I published my blog post, which, it's a 20-minute read. It's not like you're just going to glance through it, at least if you want to absorb it. But the biggest thing for me was, what lessons do we learn and what can other people learn from it? So that's the reason we told the story. But it was epic for sure. It's like the closest I've ever come to dying on a dive by far. And quite honestly, if any of us had been on open circuit, whoever was on open circuit would have died. I mean, I have no doubt about it. It's hard to bring enough open circuit gas for 3.5 hours inside a wreck at 100 feet.
It is an extremely good read. One question I wanted to, well, one, I guess I kind of have two questions on that. The first question, I'm sure that it changed the outlook and how you're going to look at future dives. I mean, just somebody reading that, it would hopefully change their mindset looking into that sort of dives. It had to have taken a lot for you to be like, I am going to publish this, because when a situation like that happens, it's hard for people to talk about it. Was it something that you wanted to get out there right away, or was there kind of like a moral thing that like, hey, I feel like I need to get this out, but I don't know if I feel like I want to? Does that question kind of make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, like I said, I all the guys that were in that wreck, I know pretty well. And we decided as a team that we wouldn't publish or say anything other than, I told my wife and things like that. But we decided we wouldn't go public with it until we were all ready. And so the reason I wrote the blog post right away and the reason I wrote the notes that I wrote, the day of and the day after the dive is because I didn't want to forget things. But, I think we all respected each other and we said, okay, like until everybody is ready to talk about it, we're not going to talk about it. And like you said, it takes some time to process and think about and be ready to talk about incidents and accidents like that. And, I think it's important to note that the reason we did it wasn't because we felt we had to. It was primarily because we wanted people to learn from it and not make the mistakes we had made. Personally, I'm fine talking about it. I mean, we learned some hard lessons, and I'm grateful to be alive, and I'm grateful that Auntie came in to rescue us. He risked his own life to do that for sure. I think everybody processes things like that differently. I'll tell you that the next day, me and two of the other divers went to the sister ship, the Eero, and we did a dive on it to see kind of where we got trapped and how we got out and what it looked like. Because, like I said, the Eero's upright, so it's kind of like one of those things like get back on the horse. But yeah, it definitely takes time to kind of process things when it happens, especially something that severe.
Yeah, no, it's a hair raising read for sure. Just because it kind of brought me back to moments going through my advanced rec course, like, being, because you kind of imagine things like that. Like, obviously you try not to. And I definitely would like to ask a few more questions, but we're kind of running down, running out of time, I should say. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but holding your composure in a situation like that and not panicking, which I'm sure it would have been really easy to do. I'm sure there's many cases where people must have not been an easy thing to do. So definitely that's a huge thing that I don't think that a lot of people would have been able to have the same outcome. So I think that's a pretty big thing, is to, like, you did not let panic set in. Random question: at any point, was there kind of moments and you just collected yourself, or was it just keep a cool head the whole time?
I don't think there was any point in time where any of the four of us were panicked. And there was definitely periods of time where I thought, I mean, quite literally, like, I'm going to die inside this thing. I don't want to say I was at peace with it, because we were basically fighting to survive and doing whatever we could to get out. But there was no point in time where any of us really, I'll call it, freaked out. I mean, I worried for sure. I mean, I turned to my dive buddy a couple times and said, I think we're fucked. Sorry, I don't know if I can cuss on the show or not, but I literally, that's what I told him. I said, I think we're fucked. Not in like a panicked way, but just more like a straightforward, like, yeah, this is pretty bad. The hardest part was when the three of us were kind of waiting for the other guy who kind of knew the wreck better than we did to see if he could find another exit. We just sat there and we turned off all our lights, and we made sure that we stayed, I'll call it, in touch, like we all could feel each other, and it was a pretty confined space. And we would check in with each other, like, you doing okay? You doing okay? I'm fine. Like, okay, how much scrubber time do you have left? How much oxygen do you have? So we communicated with each other throughout the whole incident, which I think helped. But yeah, there was no time where, oh my God, like I'm freaking out. Like it wasn't panic. It was more like just a realization, like, yeah, this could end really badly.
Well, Brett, really, really want to thank you for coming on to the podcast today. I do have just one final question for you, and then I will let you go, let you enjoy the holidays. But no, thank you very much for coming on to the podcast. Last question I have for you is somebody that is getting into photogrammetry. What little piece of advice that can you give them to make their life just a little bit easier, kind of getting into that sort of technology or aspect of diving?
Yeah, I would say if you can find somebody else who's done it who can help you. I do have resources on my website. I've given presentations on kind of the basics of how it works, how to do it, what software to use, what settings on your camera. And again, that's all free. It's not like you have to go pay for it. So you can go on my website and do some research on that. And then, I would say start on land, build a model of, I don't know, like a hedge or I don't know, a door or something like on land that, where you don't have to worry about breathing and gases and decompression, all the other stuff. Like, so start in a benign environment and then work your way up. And, I started building like models of like a gun turret and then I progressed to, big wrecks and things like that. So use the resources that are out there because there are a lot, and start on land and then slowly start doing stuff underwater. Start small and build.
Well, once again, Brett, I really, really appreciate you coming on to the podcast and sharing your story. This has been absolutely wonderful.
Hey, Nick, I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a happy holiday. And I'm looking forward to listening to it once it gets published.
Offgassing, a scuba podcast.